The cry was the only sound that mattered in a land of profound silence. It was thin, reedy, and tore through the heat-shimmering air over the New Mexico territory. It came from a wickiup of brush and hide, a fragile shelter against an unforgiving world. Inside, a man sat alone, his warrior's hands, accustomed to the bow and the knife, now fumbling with a swaddled infant. He was an Apache, a man named Taza, and his world had shrunk to the desperate, hungry wails of his newborn daughter. His wife was gone. The silence she left behind was louder than any war cry, and the baby was starving. Hope was a dying ember until a shadow fell across the doorway. The dust was a constant companion. It coated the dry earth, settled on the stiff branches of the mesquite, and filmed the inside of Taza's throat. For 3 days, it had been his only nourishment. For his daughter Chusi, whose name meant morning dove, there had been nothing but a few pathetic drops of water squeezed from a piece of damp leather. Her cries had weakened from furious squalls to pitiful breathy whimpers that twisted a knot of cold dread in Taza's gut. He held her close, her tiny body hot against his own, and stared at the empty space beside him, where his wife Nalin should have been. The fever had taken her 2 sunsets after she'd given Chusi the gift of life. It had been swift and merciless, leaving Taza adrift in a sea of grief so vast he could not see the shore. He was a Chiricahua Apache, a man who knew how to read the turning of a leaf, the track of a deer, the intention in a hawk's circling flight. But he did not know the language of an infant's needs beyond the obvious. He knew Nalin would have sung to her a low, sweet melody that spoke of the wind in the pines and the strength of the mountain. Taza's own voice was a stranger in his throat, choked with unshed tears and the grit of despair. His people were miles away, having moved with the seasons. He had stayed behind, anchored to this spot by Nalin's final breaths and the fresh mound of stones that marked her resting place under a lone cottonwood tree. Pride and sorrow had built a wall around him. To return to his band now with a failing infant felt like a deep and profound failure. He was Taza, son of a chief, a provider, and he could not provide. The sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in brutal strokes of orange and purple. The air would soon cool, but the chill that gripped Taza had nothing to do with the temperature. Chusi's whimpers faded into a terrifying silence. Her small body went limp in his arms. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through his grief-numbed haze. He jostled her gently, his calloused thumb stroking her sunken cheek. "Chusi!" He whispered the name. A prayer, a plea. "Little dove, do not fly away." He looked around the wickiup, a place that had once been filled with Nalin's quiet industry and gentle laughter. Now it was just a shell holding only silence and the scent of approaching death. He had nothing. No food, no milk, no hope. He had failed his wife in her final moments, unable to bargain with the spirits for her life. Now he was failing the only piece of her he had left. He closed his eyes, a single hot tear finally tracing a clean path through the dust on his cheek. It was over. And then he heard it. Not the whisper of the wind or the scuttle of a lizard. A footstep, a soft, deliberate crunch of boot on gravel just outside his dwelling. Taza's body went rigid. His hand instinctively went to the hilt of the knife at his belt. A white settler, a prospector. He was on the edge of the territory, far from the town of redemption, gulch but not far enough. His grief was instantly replaced by a primal protective anger. Whoever was out there had chosen the wrong day to intrude on his misery. A shadow fell across the low entrance. A hesitant knock, the soft rap of knuckles on the dried timber frame, echoed in the stillness. Taza didn't answer. He held his breath, held his daughter, and waited for the trouble he was sure was about to begin. The knock came again, softer this time, accompanied by a woman's voice. "Hello, is anyone in there? I saw your smoke signal from yesterday. I thought someone might need help." Taza remained silent, his eyes narrowed, fixed on the entrance. Smoke. He had lit a fire 2 nights ago, a foolish act of desperation, hoping a stray hunting party from his own people might see it. He hadn't considered it would draw this kind of attention. The voice was that of a white woman. Her tone was gentle, but Taza had learned long ago that gentle tones from white settlers could be as deceiving as a mirage in the desert. They spoke of peace while their eyes coveted the land. "Please," the voice continued, a note of pleading in it now. "I mean no harm. I brought some things." Still he did not move. He was a statue carved from rock and sorrow. Let her go away. Let her leave him to his fate. His pride was a shard of obsidian in his heart, sharp and unyielding. He would not accept pity from her kind. They were the reason his people were scattered, the reason the buffalo were vanishing, the reason the old ways were fading like morning mist. He heard a soft thud, the sound of a basket being set on the ground. A moment of silence passed. He thought she might be leaving, but then her shadow reappeared, and she slowly, cautiously knelt down and peered into the dim interior of the wickiup. Taza's first impression was of weariness. She was not a young woman, nor was she old. Her face, framed by strands of sun-bleached brown hair, escaping a tight bun, was etched with fine lines around her eyes and mouth. They were not lines of anger or cruelty, but of hardship, and he thought a deep, abiding sadness that he recognized because he saw it in his own reflection in still water. Her eyes, the color of a summer sky, were wide and held no malice, only a startlingly direct sort of compassion. She was dressed in a simple faded calico dress covered by a dusty apron. Her gaze fell first on him, then dropped to the still bundle in his arms. A sharp, audible intake of breath. The woman's expression shifted from cautious concern to something else, entirely, a raw, gut-wrenching empathy that transcended language and race. "Oh, Lord, have mercy," she whispered, her voice cracking. "A baby." She made no move to enter, respecting the threshold of his home. Her eyes flickered back to his face. Is the mother—" She didn't need to finish the sentence. The answer was in the hollows of his cheeks, the desolation in his eyes, the small, fresh grave under the cottonwood. Taza gave a single, almost imperceptible shake of his head. The woman closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them again, they were glistening. "My name is Josephine Dunn. My homestead is just over that rise," she said, nodding to the east. "I lost my own, a little boy, to the winter fever 3 years back. I know this kind of quiet." Her words struck Taza with the force of a physical blow. She wasn't offering pity. She was offering understanding. She spoke of a shared landscape of loss, a territory he thought he occupied alone. He watched as she reached back outside and carefully slid a woven basket into the opening. The smell of fresh bread, roasted meat, and something else, something milky and warm, filled the small space, a stark contrast to the scent of dust and death. "There's goat's milk," she said, her voice soft but firm. "It's still warm, and a broth. For you. A man can't care for a child if he's starving himself." Taza stared at the basket, as if it were a coiled rattlesnake. Every instinct screamed at him to refuse to throw it back out into the dirt, to preserve the last tattered remnants of his self-reliance. But then a tiny fluttering movement against his chest. Juicy stirred her mouth, making a weak, searching motion. That small sign of life shattered his pride into 1,000 pieces. His daughter's life was worth more than his stubbornness. His love for her was greater than his hatred for the world that had taken her mother. His eyes met Josephine Dunn's. He didn't speak. He couldn't. But for the first time in 3 days, the rigid mask of his grief cracked. He gave a slow, deep nod. Josephine's shoulders sagged with relief. "I have a bottle," she said, retrieving a glass bottle with a rubber teat from her apron pocket. It was an object as foreign to Taza as the moon. You pour the milk in." Gently, she set it down next to the basket and slowly stood up, backing away from the entrance. "I'll leave you be," she said, "but I'll come back tomorrow, with more milk. That baby needs to eat." She turned and walked away without another word. Taza listened until her footsteps faded completely. He was alone again, but the silence felt different. It was no longer empty. It was filled with the aroma of hope and the profound, unsettling reality that he had just accepted help from an enemy. He reached for the basket, his hands trembling, and for the first time since Nalin's death, he allowed himself to believe that the sun might rise tomorrow. Redemption. Gulch was a town that clung to life as tenaciously as the scrub brush that grew from its cracked, dry soil. It was a single dusty street lined with a dozen sun-bleached wooden buildings, a general store, a saloon, a blacksmith, a sheriff's office, and a church whose steeple leaned as if in constant prayer for rain. It was a place where secrets were currency, and gossip traveled faster than a stagecoach. And the biggest piece of gossip that week concerned the widow Josephine Dunn. Silas Kane watched her from the shaded porch of the saloon, a thin, unlit cheroot clenched between his teeth. Kane owned the saloon, the biggest cattle ranch in the county, and in his own mind, the town itself. He was a man whose ambition was as vast and arid as the land he sought to conquer. His face was a roadmap of shrewd dealings and quiet threats, his eyes small and dark like a vulture's. He wanted Josephine Dunn's homestead. Not for the meager cabin or the small patch of land she worked, but for what ran through it, Cimarron Creek. In a land where water was more precious than gold, the person who controlled the creek controlled everything. Her late husband, Jedediah, had been a stubborn fool who refused to sell. Now that he was gone, Silas had assumed the widow would be easy to scare off. But Josephine was proving to be as stubborn as her dead husband. His foreman, a hulking, simple-minded man named Clem, shambled up beside him, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "See her comin' back, boss," Clem grunted, gesturing with his chin. Silas followed his gaze. Josephine's wagon was rattling down the main street, coming from the direction of the territories. He'd had his men watch her. He knew she wasn't just tending her land. For the past 2 days, she'd been making trips out into the scrublands towards the Apache's camp. "She's a fool," Silas said, his voice a low growl. "Playing nursemaid to a savage. The whole town's talking." He was right. Inside Abernathy's general store, Martha Abernathy, a woman whose face was permanently pinched with disapproval, was holding court. "It ain't right," she declared to 2 other townswomen, "wasting good food on that red skin. Who knows what diseases he carries, and her a widow woman all alone out there. It's indecent." Sheriff Brody stood by the counter, slowly filling his pipe. He was a man worn down by the constant friction between law and local prejudice. He was older, his badge dull, his posture slumped with the weight of compromises he'd made over the years. "She's just being charitable, Martha," Brody said, not looking up. "The woman has a good heart." A soft head is more like it. Silas Kane's voice cut through the room as he pushed through the batwing doors. He gave the sheriff a look that was equal parts condescension and command. "Brody, you ought to do your job. That Apache is a vagrant, a danger. He's squatting on territory land. You should run him off." Brody sighed, striking a match. "He ain't causing any trouble, Silas. Far as I can tell, he's just a grieving man with a new baby." "A baby?" Martha Abernathy gasped, her hand flying to her chest. "With no mother? Oh, that poor thing." Her momentary flash of sympathy was quickly extinguished by her ingrained fear. "Still, it ain't our concern." "It becomes our concern," Silas said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial tone. "When one of our own starts consorting with them, it emboldens them. What happens when he decides he wants more than a handout? What happens when his warrior friends show up? Her homestead is the first stop on the way to this town." He let the threat hang in the air, a poisonous vapor. He was an artist of fear, painting pictures of bloodshed and terror in the minds of the suggestible. He could see it working on their faces. Sheriff Brody puffed on his pipe, his expression troubled. He knew Silas was just using the Apache as a lever to pry Josephine from her land. But he also knew the town's fear was a real volatile thing. A single spark could set the whole territory ablaze. I'll ride out and have a word with her, Silas," the sheriff said wearily. "Advise her to be cautious." Silas gave a tight, satisfied smile. "You do that, Sheriff. You advise her, before something happens that forces my hand." He turned and walked out, leaving the chill of his presence behind. He had planted the seed. Now he just had to wait for the fear to grow. The Apache, the baby, the widow. They were all just pieces in his game. And Silas Kane never played a game he didn't intend to win. For a week, a fragile, unspoken routine settled over the two solitary homesteads, separated by a mile of rock and cactus. Each morning, just after dawn, Josephine would arrive. She never came to the Wikiup's entrance anymore. Instead, she would leave a large pail of fresh goat's milk and a wrapped bundle of food, sometimes bread and jerky. Sometimes a container of warm stew on a flat rock 100 yards away. Then she would return to her cabin. It was a truce, a respectful distance that allowed Taza to keep his dignity while accepting the sustenance that was saving his daughter's life. Chusi was transforming. The terrible sunken look was gone from her face, replaced by a healthy roundness. Her cries were no longer the whimpers of a dying creature, but the robust demands of a thriving infant. She would drink the goat's milk greedily from the strange glass bottle, her tiny hands clutching Taza's finger. In those moments watching her feed, Taza felt a flicker of something he had thought long dead, a quiet, profound joy. But his pride, though battered, was not broken. He was a taker, and that sat like a stone in his belly. A warrior, a hunter, a man he provided. He did not accept charity. One morning, after retrieving the pail and the food, he did not return to his Wikiup. Instead, he walked towards the Dunn homestead, Chusi strapped securely to his back in a cradle board Narlin had painstakingly made. He stopped at the edge of Josephine's property line, where a section of her split-rail fence had collapsed, likely in a recent windstorm. Josephine was in her garden, pulling weeds her back to him. She didn't hear him approach. Taza possessed the ability to move through the world without disturbing it. He watched her for a moment. He saw the strength in her back, the deliberate efficiency of her movements. He saw the loneliness in her posture when she paused to wipe her brow, her gaze drifting to the small, fenced-off plot at the edge of her property, where a simple wooden cross stood. Jedediah, and the smaller cross beside it. Her son. Taza set down his bow and quiver and picked up the heavy axe that lay near a pile of uncut timber. He didn't ask permission. He didn't speak a word. He simply walked to the fallen fence, selected a sturdy log, and began to work. The rhythmic thwack of the axe echoed in the quiet morning air. Josephine spun around, startled, her hand flying to her chest. She saw him, his back muscles rippling under his buckskin shirt, splitting a log with clean, powerful strokes. He worked with a focused intensity, his movements economical and precise. He was not just chopping wood, he was speaking the only language he could. I am not a beggar. I pay my debts. She stood frozen for a long moment, watching him. A complex mix of emotions washed over her, surprise, a flicker of fear, and then a deep, swelling sense of understanding. She went back to her weeding, not saying a word, allowing him the dignity of his labor. This became the new routine. Every day, after he tended to Taza, would appear at the edge of Josephine's homestead and find a task to do. He repaired the fence. He chopped a mountain of firewood and stacked it neatly by her door. He rethatched a leaking patch on her barn roof. He used his tracking skills to find the den of the coyote that had been stealing her chickens and dealt with it, leaving the pelt stretched on her fence as a silent message. They rarely spoke. The gulf of language and culture was too wide. Their communication was in deeds, not words. She would leave him food and milk. He would leave her a repaired fence, a cord of wood, a sense of security. Sometimes their eyes would meet across the yard. In his, she saw a fierce, guarded respect. In hers, he saw a steady, quiet strength that reminded him painfully of Nalin. One sweltering afternoon, she was struggling to haul buckets of water from the creek to her thirsty garden. The handle on one of her wooden buckets had broken. She was trying to manage with just one, her face flushed with exertion. Taza appeared as if from the earth itself. He took the broken bucket from her, his fingers brushing hers for a fleeting second. He disappeared into the small copse of trees by the creek and returned 20 minutes later. He had fashioned a new handle from a sturdy branch, skillfully whittled and fitted stronger than the original. He handed it to her, then picked up the other bucket and began to help her water the rows of corn and squash. They worked side by side in silence, the only sounds the sloshing of water and the hum of insects. When they were done, Josephine looked at him, her face smudged with dirt, her expression soft. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Taza looked at her, then at the cradleboard where Chusi was sleeping peacefully. He gave a single curt nod, but his eyes held a flicker of something more. It wasn't gratitude. It was acknowledgement, a recognition that here, in this small patch of unforgiving land, two broken people were finding a way to mend not just fences and buckets, but the shattered pieces of their own lives. Word of Taza's daily labor on the Dunn homestead spread through Redemption Gulch like a prairie fire. What had been whispers of impropriety now became grumbles of suspicion. To the fearful and ignorant, it wasn't a man repaying a debt. It was an Apache encroaching on their world, becoming familiar, becoming a fixture. And Silas Kane was there to fan every spark of that fear into a flame. "See, I told you," he'd say to the men drinking in his saloon. First it's handouts, now he's practically living there. Sharpening her axe, fixing her roof. He's casing the place, learning its weaknesses. When his kin show up, they'll know exactly where to strike. Sheriff Brody did as he'd promised. He rode out to Josephine's homestead, his horse kicking up clouds of dust. He found her mending a dress on her porch, Taza, visible in the distance, silently clearing rocks from a patch of ground she hoped to plow. "Josephine." Brody began removing his hat and wiping his brow. "We need to talk. If it's about Mr. Kane's concerns, Sheriff, you're wasting your breath," she said, not looking up from her sewing. "This ain't just Kane anymore," Brody insisted, his voice heavy. "Folks are scared. They see an Apache warrior with a knife on his belt working 50 yards from your door. It ain't a good look." "He is a father," Josephine shot back, her needle pausing. "He is a widower. And he is an honorable man who insists on working for the food that's keeping his child alive. Have you seen the baby sheriff? Or do you just see the color of her father's skin?" Brody sighed, the argument draining from him. Be that as it may, he can't stay. He's on territorial land, not reservation land. I'm getting pressure, Josephine. Real pressure. For your own safety, you should stop this arrangement. Let him move on. "He is no threat to me," she said, her voice steely. "The only threats I've had have come from a white man who wants my water. You tell Silas Kane to worry about his own fences and leave me to mine." The sheriff left, defeated and anxious. The battle lines were being drawn. Silas Kane, realizing the sheriff was too weak-willed to do his bidding, decided on a more direct approach. The next afternoon he sent his foreman Clem and another hard-faced ranch hand named Walker. They didn't ride to Josephine's cabin. They rode straight for Taza. Taza was near the creek, stripping bark from a willow branch to fashion a toy for Truce, who was sleeping in her cradleboard, propped against a tree nearby. The thunder of hooves made him look up, his body instantly tensing. He rose slowly to his feet, the half-finished toy in one hand, his other hand resting near his knife. Clem reined his horse in so close that Taza was splattered with flecks of foam from the animal's mouth. "That's far enough, savage!" Clem snarled, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "Your little holiday is over. Mr. Kane wants you gone. Take your brat and get back to whatever hole you crawled out of." Taza's face was a mask of stone. He said nothing. His eyes, dark and flat, moved from Clem to Walker, who was circling around behind him, trying to flank him. He measured the distance, calculated the angles. His stillness was more menacing than any threat. "You deaf!" Walker sneered. "He said get." Taza's gaze settled back on Clem. He did not look at the man's gun. He looked into his eyes. He let the silence stretch, filling it with a palpable sense of danger. He had faced 20 armed soldiers with nothing but a knife and a rock. These two loud, arrogant men were like children playing with fire. "This is not your land to give orders on," Taza said, his voice low and guttural, the English words tasting like ash in his mouth. Clem laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "It's our land now, and we're telling you to leave." He started to swing his leg over to dismount, his intention clear. In a movement so fast it was almost a blur, Taza dropped the willow branch, drew his knife, and threw it. The blade didn't fly at Clem. It spun through the air and thudded deep into the thick pommel of Clem's saddle, not an inch from his thigh. The thwump of the impact was followed by a gasp from Clem and the frightened whinny of his horse. Clem stared, his face pale, at the quivering hilt of the knife buried in his saddle. If Taza had aimed for his leg, it would be pinned to the leather. He understood the message perfectly. It wasn't an attack. It was a demonstration of skill. It was a warning. Taza took a single step forward. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Leave," he said. The one word carried more weight than all of Clem's blustering threats. Walker, who had been moving to Taza's rear, froze, his hand hovering over his own gun. He saw the cold certainty in Taza's eyes and knew they were outmatched. This wasn't some drunken farmer. This was a predator. Clem, unnerved, yanked on his reins. He couldn't retrieve the knife without dismounting, and he wasn't about to do that. He shot Taza a look of pure hatred. "This ain't over," he spat. He wheeled his horse around and galloped away, Walker close behind him. Taza watched them go, his expression unreadable. He walked to the tree, checked on the still sleeping Truce, and then pulled his knife from Clem's saddle, which had fallen to the ground when the spooked horse bolted. The immediate threat was gone, but Taza knew this was only the beginning. The serpent had shown its fangs. Next it would strike. The confrontation with Clem and Walker changed something in the air. The quiet truce was over. A heavy sense of foreboding settled over Josephine's homestead, as tangible as the evening chill. Taza no longer worked in the open fields. He stayed closer to the wickiup, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, his bow always within arm's reach. He was a sentinel watching over the woman and the child who had become the center of his fractured world. Josephine felt it too. The silence from town was more unnerving than the gossip had been. When she made her weekly trip for supplies, Mr. Abernathy sold her flour and beans with his eyes averted, and Martha shot her a look of cold fury. Sheriff Brodie was nowhere to be seen. She was an outcast, branded a traitor to her own kind. She was alone save for the silent Apache warrior keeping watch from the trees. The breaking point came 3 nights later. The moon was a sliver in a starless, ink-black sky. A hot, dry wind kicked up, rustling the corn stalks in the garden and rattling the frame of Josephine's cabin. It was a wind that carried the scent of trouble. Taza was not asleep. He sat outside his wickiup chusi, sleeping inside, and listened to the language of the night. He heard the wind, the cry of a distant coyote, and then something else. The muffled clink of metal on rock, the nervous snort of a horse trying to stay quiet. They were coming, and not just 2 of them. He moved without a sound, melting into the deeper shadows of the rocks and mesquite. He circled wide, approaching Josephine's homestead from the south, downwind. He saw them then, 4 riders dismounted, their faces hidden by low-brimmed hats. Silas Kane was there, directing the others with sharp, angry gestures. Clem and Walker were with him, and a 4th man Taza didn't recognize. In their hands, they carried not guns, but torches and cans of oil. Their plan was horrifyingly simple. They weren't there to talk. They were there to erase the problem, burn the cabin, destroy the barn, and scare her off the land for good. If she happened to be inside, well, accidents happened. Taza's blood ran cold. This was not a fight for honor. This was a murderous rage, fueled by greed. He had only a bow, a knife, and the element of surprise. 4 men, at least 2 of them, armed with pistols. The odds were impossible. But inside that cabin was the woman who had saved his daughter. He would not let them harm her. He notched an arrow, but he didn't aim for a man. He aimed for the lantern hanging on Kane's saddle. He drew the bowstring back, his breath held steady, and released. The arrow flew true, a dark streak in the night. It smashed the glass of the lantern, extinguishing the one steady light they had. What in the hell? Kane swore, spinning around. In the ensuing confusion, Taza slipped away, circling to the east, where the horses were tied. With swift, silent cuts of his knife, he sliced through the reins of 3 of the horses, leaving only Kane's mount untouched. Panic was a better weapon than any arrow. Back at the cabin, the men were spooked. It was him. It was the Apache. Clem yelled, fumbling to light another torch. Suddenly a shotgun blast roared from the cabin's front window, the buckshot tearing through the air high above their heads. "Get off my land!" Josephine's voice, tight with fear, but ringing with defiance, cut through the night. She was awake. She was fighting. "Burn it!" Kane shrieked, his composure gone. "Burn it all!" Clem and Walker rushed forward, their torches held high. They splashed oil on the dry wooden walls of the barn. But as Clem reared back to throw his torch, another of Taza's arrows hissed out of the darkness and buried itself deep in his shoulder. He screamed, dropping the torch, which sputtered and died in the dust. Walker, seeing his partner go down, panicked. He threw his torch wildly towards the cabin. It fell short, landing in a patch of dry grass. The wind immediately seized the flames, and a wall of fire erupted, racing not towards the cabin, but towards the dry, open field that separated the homestead from the creek. "The fire, it's out of control!" the fourth man yelled, backing away. Kane saw his plan unraveling into chaos. His men were useless. The Apache was a ghost in the dark, and the fire was now a raging beast threatening to consume everything, including them. "To the horses!" he screamed. They scrambled back to find their mounts, frantic, their reins severed. Only Kane's horse was usable. Without a moment's hesitation, he leapt into the saddle. "Every man for himself!" he shouted and galloped away into the darkness, abandoning his men to their fate. Clem clutching his bleeding shoulder, Walker and the other man stared in disbelief after their boss silhouetted for a moment against the terrifying orange glow of the spreading wildfire. Their murderous intent had turned into a desperate flight for survival. They fled on foot, disappearing into the night, their only thought to escape the monster they had unleashed. Taza ignored them. The immediate threat was no longer from men, but from the fire. The wind was pushing it straight towards the cottonwood grove by the creek and directly towards his wickiup, where Truce lay sleeping. A primal fear, colder and sharper than any he had ever known, seized him. He broke from the shadows and sprinted, his heart pounding against his ribs, not away from the fire, but towards the one thing in the world he could not bear to lose. Josephine saw him then, a desperate figure running not towards her, but away from her towards the creek. For a terrifying second, she thought he was abandoning her to the flames. Then she understood. His camp, the baby. Without a second thought, she grabbed 2 heavy horse blankets from a chest, her mind racing. Jedediah had taught her about prairie fires. You don't outrun them, you meet them. Taza reached his wickiup, just as the first tongues of flame began to lick at the dry brush nearby. The air was thick with smoke, stinging his eyes and choking his lungs. He dove inside, grabbing the cradleboard Truce's frightened wails joining the roar of the fire. He emerged, his daughter clutched to his chest, and found himself trapped. The fire was a closing semicircle, its heat so intense it felt like a physical blow. The creek was behind him, but the banks were too steep to climb with a child in his arms. Just as despair began to set in, he saw her. Josephine, her face grim with determination, was running towards him, dragging the heavy blankets. She wasn't running from the fire. She was running to him. "The creek!" she yelled over the inferno's roar. "Soak them!" He understood instantly. Together they scrambled down the bank and plunged the blankets into the cool water of the Cimarron. They became incredibly heavy, but it was their only shield. Hauling them back up the bank, they held one of the soaked, steaming blankets in front of them, like a wall, and pushed through the weakest point in the fire line. The heat was unbearable, the smoke blinding. Embers rained down on them, hissing as they struck the wet wool. For a few desperate, terrifying seconds, they were inside the fire itself. Then they were through, staggering into the blackened, smouldering field on the other side, gasping for air, their faces covered in soot, their lungs burning. They had made it. They were alive. Truce sheltered between them, coughed once, then began to cry with healthy, furious relief. They stood there for a long moment, 2 solitary figures in a landscape of devastation, the first hints of dawn painting the smoky sky a bruised purple. The fire, having consumed the dry grass, was already beginning to die down, leaving a black, smoking scar on the land. Her barn was a heap of glowing embers. Her fields were scorched, but the cabin had been spared, and they were alive. Josephine finally sank to her knees, her body trembling with adrenaline and exhaustion. Taza knelt beside her, gently rocking his crying daughter. He looked at Josephine, at this woman who had run towards the fire to help him, the woman who had trusted him, who had shown him a kindness he thought no longer existed in the world. "They are gone," he said, his voice raspy from the smoke. "Cain," she whispered, her voice full of a weary anger. It was Silas Cain. He ran. Taza said, a note of contempt in his voice. "He left his men." He then described seeing Clem hit with the arrow. Proof. As the sun climbed higher, a lone rider approached. It was Sheriff Brody, drawn by the glow of the fire visible from town. He took in the scene, the smouldering fields, the destroyed barn, Josephine and Taza, huddled together, covered in soot, a crying baby between them. Josephine stood up, her exhaustion replaced by a cold, hard fury. She told him everything. She told him about Cain's threats, about Clem and Walker's intimidation. Then Taza stepped forward. He laid Clem's saddle with his knife, still buried in it from their first encounter, on the ground. He held out the arrow he had pulled from Clem's shoulder after the man had fled. The evidence was undeniable. Sheriff Brody looked from the proof to the devastation, and then to the two survivors. Something inside him, long dormant, seemed to shift. This was no longer about appeasing a powerful man. This was about a failed murder and arson. "I'll form a posse," Brody said, his voice finally firm, the weariness replaced by resolve. "We'll find Clem. He'll talk. As for Silas Cain, his reign in this valley is over." He rode off, a man with a renewed purpose. Taza and Josephine were left standing in the morning light amidst the ruins of what had been their fragile peace. He looked at the smoking remains of her barn, the blackened earth. "I cannot pay for this," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of the destruction he felt he had brought upon her. Josephine looked at him, then at Truce, who had finally quieted in his arms. She reached out and for the first time touched his arm. Her hand was small and warm against his skin. "This was not your debt to pay, Taza," she said, speaking his name for the first time. "This was the cost of decency, and we paid it together." He looked down at her hand and then back into her eyes. The walls between them, built of race of grief and of fear, had been burned away in the night's fire. They were no longer a white woman and an Apache warrior. They were Josephine and Taza, two survivors, a family forged not by blood, but by courage and compassion, ready to build something new from the ashes. The sun, now fully risen, did little to warm them. A chill had settled deep in their bones, the kind that comes after a battle is won, and the body finally admits its exhaustion. They stood in the grey light, surveying the black, smoking wound on the land. The barn was a skeleton of charred timbers. The garden was a field of ash. Yet the small cabin stood untouched, a stubborn testament to their victory. Taza looked toward the creek. His wickiup was gone, completely consumed. All that he had owned, the few tools, the spare hides, the small carvings he had made in memory of Nalin, had vanished into smoke. All except for Truce, who now slept soundly against his chest, her tiny face peaceful despite the devastation around her. He had nothing left but his daughter. Josephine followed his gaze, her heart aching for this fresh loss piled upon his old one. "You'll stay here," she said. It was not a question or an offer, but a simple statement of fact. "There's room in the cabin. It is safe." Taza looked at her soot-stained face, and the fierce, protective light that still burned in her eyes. In the Apache way, a man didn't live under the roof of a woman who was not his kin or his wife. It was a breach of custom of propriety. But the world of his customs felt 1,000 miles away. His new world consisted of this small patch of land, this stubborn woman, and the child in his arms. He gave a slow, deep nod. Acceptance, Later that morning, just as they were beginning the grim task of clearing debris, they heard the sound of approaching wagons. Tarza's hand went to his knife, his body tensing, but Josephine laid a calming hand on his arm. "Wait," she whispered. It was Sheriff Brodie, but he was not alone. Behind him was a wagon driven by Mr. Abernathy from the general store, its bed filled with shovels, axes, and canvas sacks of food. Another wagon followed, driven by a German blacksmith named Peterson, and beside them on horseback were two ranchers whose properties bordered Kane's. They were men who had been silent before, intimidated by Kane's power, but who were silent no longer. They stopped at the edge of the burned field, their faces a mixture of shame and grim resolve. Mr. Abernathy climbed down from his wagon, his hat in his hands. "Josephine," he said, his voice thick with emotion. The town, we were wrong, blinded by fear. What Kane did, it was an evil that shames us all." He looked over at Tarza, his gaze direct and apologetic. "We came to help rebuild." Tarza watched, guarded and silent, as the men began to work. They pulled down the hazardous charred beams of the barn. They shoveled away ash and debris. They worked with the quiet determination of men trying to atone for a sin of inaction. Tarza, after a long moment, handed the cradleboard to a watchful Josephine and picked up an axe. He worked alongside them, his movements powerful and efficient. The other men who had once seen him as a threat now watched him with a grudging respect, noting the skill with which he assessed the stability of a beam or the sure-footed way he moved through the wreckage. He was not just a warrior, he was a builder. For 3 days they labored. Josephine organized the work, providing water and what food she had left. By the 3rd evening, the last of the debris was cleared, leaving a clean, flat space where the barn had once stood. Sheriff Brodie, who had ridden out to join the posse, returned with news. They had found Clem hiding in an old miner's shack, his shoulder wound festering. He had confessed to everything, naming Silas Kane as the man who gave the orders, who lit the first torch. "Kane is gone," Brodie announced to the small group. "He fled north. But his name is mud in this territory. His empire is built on credit and fear, and both have run out. He's a wanted man, a fugitive. He'll never show his face here again." A collective sigh of relief went through the workers. The shadow that had loomed over the valley had finally passed. That evening, as the men packed their tools to leave, Tarza walked into the cabin. He stopped in the doorway. On the floor near the hearth, Josephine had laid a soft blanket, and on it rested Choosy's cradleboard. She had found it near the creek, miraculously untouched by the fire, though stained with smoke. She had carefully cleaned the wood and restitched a small tear in the buckskin. It sat in the warm, safe cabin as if it belonged there. It was a silent, profound invitation. It was Josephine telling him that his past, his heritage, the memory of his wife, embodied in that craft. It was all welcome here. This was not just a shelter. It was a home. He looked at her, and a lifetime of words passed between them in that silent gaze. He walked over and gently placed his sleeping daughter into the cradleboard. Her new home. Autumn came, painting the leaves of the cottonwood by the creek in shades of gold. A new barn, smaller but sturdy, stood where the old one had fallen, a monument to the community's change of heart. Tarza and Josephine had planted a late-season crop in the garden, and small green shoots were pushing their way through the ash-fertilized soil. One evening, they sat together on the porch, watching the sun set. Choosy, now a happy, gurgling baby, played on a blanket at their feet. Tarza had spent the day teaching Josephine how to read the tracks of deer at the edge of the property. She had spent the afternoon teaching him the English words for the tools in the new barn. The silence between them was no longer one of grief or uncertainty. It was a comfortable shared peace. Taza reached over his calloused hand, covering hers. It was a simple touch, but it held the promise of every sunrise to come. They were no longer just two survivors. They were a family, planting their roots deep into the scorched earth, ready to build a future not defined by the fires they had endured, but by the home they had found in each other. In the harsh and often brutal landscape of the Old West, survival was a daily battle. But the story of Taza and Josephine Dunn reminds us that the greatest wilderness is not the one made of rock and sand, but the one that lies within the human heart. It's a story about how the quietest acts of kindness can be louder than the loudest expressions of hate. It shows us that courage isn't about the absence of fear, but about facing that fear to protect what matters most. Their story asks us to look past the surface, past our own prejudices, to see the shared humanity that connects us all, the grief of a father, the compassion of a mother, the universal need for a safe place to call home. If this story of survival courage and unlikely connection resonated with you, please help us share more tales like it. Hit that like button, share this video with someone who appreciates a powerful story, and be sure to subscribe to our channel. Your support allows us to keep the campfires burning and the stories of the West alive. Thank you for listening.